Good day. This is the fifth session in our working capital and current asset management series, and we're going to discuss the accounts receivable management in this session and the next session, looking at what the accounts receivable, how we provide credit to customers, and also the impact of extending, for instance, credit terms to customers and relaxing some of those credit terms. So a company like Ford, they focus on, for one, their working capital ratio and a accounts receivable forming part of the working capital management, and an indication of too much working capital accounts receivable would be that the working capital ratio would be too high. Yes, a working capital ratio could also be too high, and that is if there are too much stock in the business, or alternatively if the accounts receivable starts getting out of hand. Then it is an indication through the working capital ratio that the number starts getting too high. Accounts receivable originates from the credit sales to customers. When we look at credit sales, first, the criteria that are set to select the potential customers that we will allow on credit. There's a provision process and the terms of the provisioning, then also the processing of the applications, the processing of the credit, and in the last instance the collection and making sure that the customers pay on time, and those that have not paid, how do we collect on those outstanding balances. So the objective of accounts receivable is, on the one side, to minimize the accounts receivable collection period. So we need to manage this and make sure that it is as short as possible. On the other side, we also need to consider the impact on sales and the relationship with our customers. If we are too aggressive, it might just offend the customers and they might shift their business somewhere else. So there's a very sensitive balance that needs to be struck between collecting as quickly as possible, but also not impacting the sales and the potential sales. The benefits of credit sales are obviously an increase in sales, because customers will often shift their business towards a company that would provide credit terms, and especially if they are more lenient than some of their other competitors, they will win the business over with credit terms. And additional sales will obviously lead to increased profits in most cases. Some of the risks in selling on credit is, the first one, because there are higher number of outstanding balances and often for a longer period, it increases the risk of credit losses. There's also a burden on the funding resources and to be able to fund the open accounts receivable, and then administration of these additional accounts receivable and the higher balances, and as well as the longer outstanding balances, that puts a huge burden on a company whose primary business are often not the collection of outstanding balances, but more the production and sales of products. So accounts receivable management, we're going to discuss at the hand of the following elements. The first one is a credit selection and standards, and this is this session as well as the next one. And then we're going to move to credit terms and the collection policies in the subsequent session, and then the last section relating to accounts receivable will be on credit monitoring, international accounts, and also the Customer Protection Act in South Africa. So Credit selection standards, that deals with the credit worthiness of a customer, whether they are good enough in our criteria to be allowed to buy on credit, and we also need to set certain credit control policies, which are the minimum requirements that needs to be met for a customer to be able to buy on credit. Credit worthiness is supported by 5 elements, or 5 C's. The first one is the character, in other words, the let's call it the personality of the customer, his attitude or her attitude towards credit, and there some research needs to be done to make sure that this is a conscientious type of customer that do in fact honor their outstanding balances, and that they pay their outstanding amounts on time. The second one is the capacity. They need to have the flow of income and the ability to pay. I think that goes without saying. Then capital, is the capital structure of their company sufficient to warrant the open balances that they're now taking on. And as a credit provider, the company needs to assess the ability of the customer to be able to not only pay from income, but whose capital structure of the company is sufficient to cover the outstanding balances. And then collateral goes hand in hand with this. Does the company have any collateral that they can offer, like a fixed deposit or a bank guarantee, or some fixed property that they might be able to put up as collateral and security for the open balances. And then the last part, in terms of the conditions of the customer, the economic conditions, the industry that they trade in, are those favorable, or are that industry or that specific company and competitors under pressure? There's also a credit scoring that's been done, and very often companies that provides high volumes of credit and where the values are not that high, so that's often a consumer card type of approach. The statistical methods are then used to do a scoring on the customer, so each one is not assessed individually through a thorough process. It is more setting up a criteria. The customer's details are fed into the criteria, and then a yes or no decision is taken. These could also be linked to some of the financial distress prediction models that has been developed over many years, and companies that trade in this type of environment deals or has access to either these models, or they have developed them themselves through experience. But they are valuable tools to process especially high volume applications and manage these very efficiently. So in the next session, we're going to take this one step further and investigate a little bit on the relaxing of credit standards. But credit standards can not only relaxed, it could also be strengthened a little bit, and then it will obviously have the opposite effect of the following. So on relaxing, it will often lead to increased sales, or it's expected. That's the purpose of doing this. It will lead to increased credit losses because of the additional outstanding balances that is now created by the relaxing of the standards. And the company will have additional business expenses in running the open accounts receivable, and also throughout the legal process if some of these accounts go to that extent. And the ultimate is to determine what the net effect of these aspects are, so that the decision can be taken, an informed decision, whether to relax or alternatively to strengthen the credit terms. So that brings us to the end of this section. The next part will deal with also the accounts receivable, but as we said, to relax and do a little bit of calculation on the relaxing of the credit terms and seeing what the impact of that is and whether a decision in that respect should or should not be taken.